Who are you? You don't know. Don't tell me Negro, that's nothing. What were you before the white man named you a Negro? And where were you? And what did you have? What was yours? What language did you speak then? 20 million black people don't even know their own language. Why? Because he took it away from them. 20 million black people who don't even know the history of their ancestors. Why? Because he took it away from them. And if you try and tell them how thoroughly and completely they've been robbed, he says you're teaching hate. Dark people who have been oppressed and exploited by those who are not their own kind, strangers. So the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is come together against the common enemy. Aborigines, which means what? Black folks. You never find a white aborigine. Rather, aborigines are called natives, or they're always dark-skinned people. You and I are aborigines, but you don't like to be called an aborigine. You want to be called an American. Aborigine actually means from the beginning. It's two Latin words. Ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning. Ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning. Ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning. Ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning.
Turn it up. Look, 100 years after 100 years, they done lied to us about this and that. Told us all we from Africa. I made fiction characters turn into facts. Heard you tell me then it was not. Knowing goddamn well that trick was cap. My wife and I wrote a book about it. It's a book with knowledge, evidence, and fact. And my other book got them haters shook, cause it's helping my people take a closer look at their backgrounds in the background, showing my people where they supposed to look. Showing my people where to get it from, where they hit it from, all sorts of angles. When it comes to this research, you must please first, don't trust strangers. Find out all of your own is what I highly recommend and suggest. And if you looking for answers and content about me, I highly recommend you the best. Which is my website at the link you see just across the screen. Don't let it miss you. I make it simple. I double down on that black and white. It's too official.
Now, in today's society of America, millions of so-called African Americans are struggling to come to grips with their true identity, culture, heritage, and history, mainly due to the numerous manipulative tactics utilized to govern their critical thinking mechanisms and to also decimate their literacy capabilities. Each one of these manipulative social engineering experiments can only be detected and detached from one's subconscious when standing outside of the box. I'll let you ponder on what's happening to those that are still inside of it. Meanwhile, you have not and will not ever hear me promote any form of religion throughout any of my content that I present to the public. Reason being is due to religion, faith, and beliefs being based on one's personal relationships. And I am not here to debate nor argue about who you should or should not love. That's simply none of my business. So let's also be sure to not confuse the truth that I present throughout my content with any personal beliefs that you may have. Now in this segment, you will learn about who you truly are and where you really came from based on truthful information. Because mind you, there is a big difference between truth and facts. Facts are merely controversial information, whereas a person bears the opinion to debate its credibility or not. That's yet another form of belief. Whereas the truth is non-debatable due to its credibility of always making logical sense. This is why in today's society, most people don't even care about the truth. Why? Well, because to them, unfortunately, a lie is more entertaining. So now let's start with March 1st, 1790, when then President George Washington and Vice President John Adams, along with Speaker of the House Frederick Muhlenberg, signed the 1790 Census Act. According to the census itself, it states that the 1790 Census Act is a law that, quote, required that every household be visited, that completed census schedules be posted in 2 of the most public places within each jurisdiction, there to remain for the inspection of all concerned, and that the aggregate amount of each description of persons for every district be transmitted to the president. So let me point out that some households, not all, were visited by these individuals entitled as census enumerators, also known as census takers, who are technically federal government unsupervised employees who allegedly went from town to town, city to city, and door to door, deciding who was of what race and then documented the family they meet as such. So you mean to tell me that these census takers were provided instructions by way of the government to document and record the ethnic category of various family members based on their perception of the family when they visited? And their opinions were considered to be official historical records of information? Even though they did not count every individual living within the United States due to the multiple indigenous Niji raids and rebellions occurring during this time period, the alleged first official census of the entire United States was implemented on a day dubbed as Census Day on August 2nd, 1790. See now, what's very important to note here is that the quote, free people of color were recorded all in one group, and also note that it states free and not freed, as if they were freed people from some form of enslavement. I go into more detail about the census labels in the documentary that I'll link above right now, but I said all of that for a particular reason, and that is the official 1790 U.S. Census population count was a total of 3,929,214 people. But keep in mind that this total amount did not reflect millions of people who were indigenous to North America, aka Turtle Island, meaning they did not come from another continent, nor did it reflect the accurate total amount of so-called slaves in North America. Why? Well, the U.S. Census Agency themselves admitted to not possessing the majority of their official historical records of information that was allegedly documented between the 1790 U.S. Census and all the way up to the 1830 U.S. Census. And their excuse was to claim that these records were lost or destroyed somehow. See, this was all purposely done for 2 reasons. A, to hide the truth about the real history surrounding the U.S. and slavery. I mean, generally speaking, you can literally prove to yourself that your ancestors were slaves or not by documentation. You can check and see if your ancestors came off a boat. I've been sharing this information publicly for years now, along with my sources. And I still have not heard from anyone that used my instructions to trace their family that I have available on Amazon Prime and anywhere else books are sold, that one of their ancestors were documented as being a former slave. The people that reached out to me that has or is currently undergoing research on their family's history have not failed with discovering that their family members were either never enslaved and has always been free, or worked as an indentured servant for money, land ownership, business ownership, etc., and considered to be freedmen once their obligations of servitude expired. Make no mistake, when you hear the term freedman from now on, freedman does not necessarily mean that he or she was freed from enslavement, because it can also mean relieved from their duties in most commonly known cases. So this first reason to allegedly lose or destroy these records was to hide the truth that it was a very small amount of copper-colored slaves and a greater amount of prisoners of war in North America. And the second reason is B, to hide the truth about who are the real minority and majority in terms of the population count here in the United States of America. In which this brings me to my very next point. The biggest portion of their agenda was the abominable sabotaging of the indigenous Niji's history, legacy, languages, culture, and heritage systematically. So of course they couldn't pull this task off on their own. So they implemented a methodology format based solely on the scientific concepts of eugenics. According to the National Archives, the term eugenics was coined by a British natural scientist and explorer named Francis Galton in the year of 1883. Now, there are two sides to every coin, so I'll be sure to flip each side over, and I'm not theoretically speaking here. Eugenics was implemented to help improve one selected group of people and their future generations to come, to overtake and oversee yet another set group of people and their future generations by way of extermination of their mindsets. This rabbit hole goes much deeper than one may assume. Allow me to simplify the explanation of this paramount method utilized by the likes of your industrialized institutions throughout America still to this very day. Eugenics literally changes everything that any person was ever taught of or even thought of previously before this selection was carried out upon him or her. According to Francis Galton himself, this system would allow, quote, more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable, end quote. Galton was heavily influenced by the likes of an English naturalist, biologist, and the first ever self-proclaimed documented bigoted genealogist, Charles Darwin. Darwin single-handedly developed the controversial theory of human evolution, which was his belief that man came from monkeys, and then his system of natural selection, which included a heavy flux of racial derogatory.
Since 1859, that's when Charles Darwin introduced Origin of Species by natural selection and the favored human races. Did you know that today they only report half the title that Charles Darwin wrote? His title had to do with favored human races, assigning supremacy to the Aryan race, all others being inferior. How many knew that? Only a handful. His book was racist, and that was the basic purpose for writing it.
During the early 1900s, the social engineering aspect of Darwin's theory became popular worldwide amongst many scientists alike, high-ranking politicians, and it even caught the eye of the elitists. More about this in the second installment concerning this topic. But I mention all of this to inform you that they played a prominent role in elevating the advancement of eugenics, specifically for the sake of their own race, disguised as if this was for the benefit of all humanity at a cost of whatever they desire. They were religiously following this formula or rule, dubbing it as survival of the fittest. In other words, Charles Darwin's theory of human evolution was merely a way to elevate and escalate the implementation of white supremacy and to eradicate those who were of non-pale complexions, deeming it as survival of the fittest, where those who did not meet their racist criteria, motives, and agendas would suffer from a variety of forms of propaganda that was hypothesized to eliminate the opposing race of people. Eugenics is literally a modernized pseudoscience that was based merely on racial discrimination and environmental injustice, socially, physically, and mentally, but became prosperous still due to its popularity of praises from those who gravitated towards inequality and racial estrangement. On the date of September 25, 2008, in a statement made before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs by Representative James P. Moran on the grounds of the Thomasina E. Jordan Indian Tribes of Virginia Federal Recognition Act, Moran stated, quote, "This is a travesty that this committee can correct. The second unique circumstance for the Virginia tribes is what they experienced at the hands of the state government during the first half of the 20th century. It has been called a paper genocide, at a time when the federal government granted Native Americans the right to vote. Virginia's elected officials adopted racially hostile laws targeted at those classes of people who did not fit into the dominant white society. The fact that some of Virginia's ruling elite claimed to be blood descendants of Pocahontas, in their view, meant that no one else in Virginia can make a claim they were Native American and a descendant of Pocahontas's people. To do so would mean that Virginia's ruling elite were what they decreed all non-whites to be, part of the inferior Negroid race. With great hypocrisy, Virginia's ruling elite pushed politics that culminated with the enactment of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. This act directed state officials and zealots like Walter Plecker to destroy state and local courthouse records and reclassify in Orwellian fashion all non-whites as colored. It targeted Native Americans with a vengeance, denying Native Americans in Virginia their identity. To call yourself a Native American in Virginia was to risk a jail sentence of up to 1 year, end quote. Now, in this statement, he used the term Native American, but the truth is that our identities were changed not from Native American, but from Indian to colored. And they were not only jailing people in Virginia for claiming their true identity, but they were also killing them by hanging them from a tree, and in more ways than one that I won't mention, in each state across North America. The biggest bigoted racist white supremacist of them all was none other than Walter Ashby Plecker.
The Plecker era was truly one of the darkest times for Native people in Virginia. But I think it's critical for us to think about what was the genesis of the ideology that Plecker was a proponent of. And it's really the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement was a pseudo-scientific movement. We say pseudo-scientific today because we find that the science that they were proposing is not what we today would honor as scientific in any way. The eugenics movement has a direct link to the descendants of Charles Darwin. They somehow made the leap to these notions about racial purity. What is best for each race is racial purity. Plecker and his friends convinced the Virginia legislature to adopt very restrictive legislation in 1924. It's called the Racial Integrity Act. With this legislation, it was decreed that there were only two possible categories. One is white, which means a person, you check that you're white if you have white ancestry, Caucasian ancestry, and absolutely nothing else. The other category is everybody else, and that's colored. So this was very hard on Virginia's indigenous community because in a sense it wipes away their identity on paper. Their ability to describe themselves as Indian was not possible. To describe themselves as Indian was not possible.
Keep in mind that our elder family members' birth certificates were changed multiple times to state colored, Negro, mulatto, and now Black or African American as their classifications of racial identity by way of the federal government systematically. So the moral of this segment is that you have been lied to by your government, your president and politicians, your news media, your school teachers, college and university professors, your public school history curriculums, multiple out of Africa theory books, and even by the very people that share the same hue as you and I. And that's a whole nother story within itself. Now, I challenge each and every one of you to seriously research your mother or your grandmother or your great-grandmother's birth certificates right now. And if it has the letter C or COL dot or colored and every other misclassified title of race created by the government that I just mentioned, then at that moment you will know the absolute truth about who you really are.
I've been around doing this for a long, long time. I don't always get it right, but I always take responsibility. When I get it wrong, I acknowledge I got it wrong. But my overarching objective, if we cannot make significant progress on racial equity, this country is doomed. It is doomed, not just because of African Americans, but this country is doomed. It is doomed, not just because of African Americans, but because by 2040, this country is going to be minority white European. You hear me? Minority white European.
Those of you that say Black Lives Matter, I feel sorry for you. Do you really believe you have a black life? Do you want me to read to you the meaning of black? Who called you black? Shouldn't you have rejected that from the beginning? A contradiction, a bundle of contradiction. Black means the absence of color. Absence of color. Absence of good. Absence of light. Absence of direction. That's the meaning of black. Black is not a color. It is the absence of color. Don't you understand it? They keep laughing at you as you call yourself black. They keep laughing at you. Open any dictionary, find out the meaning of black, and tell me if you find anything good. And you are not black. You've got to change it. The same way Negro became a racial slur, black should be labeled a racial slur. When it is used in connection with you, black should be labeled a racial slur. When it is used in connection with you, black should be labeled a racial slur. When it is used in connection with you.
To watch all of my exclusive content not featured here on my channel, log on to my website at imjustheretomakeyoutthink.com/films. Throughout today's society of America, millions of so-called blacks or African Americans are settling for a complex description of their historical ethnicity based solely on the fictitious thoughts of particular strangers who were assigned with the responsibility of documenting a person's classification of race by the color of their skin in which they see, or their best personal opinion of what an individual should be generally racially classified as. These particular individuals were entitled as census enumerators, also known as census takers, or the U.S. Marshals, who are federally government unsupervised employees that was said to have allegedly gone from town to town, city to city, and door to door, deciding who was of what race, and then documented the families they meet as such. The Marshals, or the census enumerators, had and still has a mammoth amount of influence on genealogy records. In fact, what they informally documented on a sheet of paper was literally based on their individual opinions, and then later deemed as official records that were sacrosanct, leading to hundreds of years of whatever the census takers' ideas of race were officially credited as historical facts of information. So, in simpler terms, these census takers were provided strict instructions by the government to record the ethnic category of various family members based on their perception of the family when they visited. So if you are attempting to find and interpret data about your family's history, these results can be confusing, especially if in one census your family has been recorded under the category all other free persons or slaves, and then free persons of color, then mulatto, and even black. During the earlier years of census taking, there were no categories for Indian at all, while in later census records, Indians were recorded all in one categoric group known as Free People of Color. Most census of today are mysteriously skipping the classification of race altogether, meaning that this particular portion of a birth certificate, for example, is purposely left blank, but only for people ranging from light to dark brown skin complexions. In part 1 of this segment, I shared congressional records uncommonly known by the public that details the truth about census records and why the choice of your family's classification of race was solely up to the individual census taker of that particular area and not your family members. The complexity of census records is in fact outrageously discombobulating, but still very utilitarian for research purposes and enthralling nonetheless. During the early half of the year 1790, Congress assigned full responsibility of census taking to the marshals of the U.S. judicial districts under an act that governed census taking through the years 1790 to 1840. It was then called the 1790 Census Act, having been signed by then President George Washington, Vice President John Adams, and the Speaker of the House, Frederick Muhlenberg, on March 1st, 1790. During this time period, there were many open political debates about who should be counted, and they also struggled with the idea of allowing indentured servants to be counted equally as the same as free whites. There was an economic structure already in place to this entire governmental construct that was not limited to taxation only, which sparked the debate with Northerners wanting slaves or indentured servants to be counted as equivalent of free whites, as the Southerners did not. Eventually, there was a compromise established, and August 2nd, 1790 marked the date of the official census day. According to the Census Bureau, the 1790 law required that, quote, every household be visited that completed census schedules be posted in 2 of the most public places within each jurisdiction, there to remain for the inspection of all concerned, and that the aggregate amount of each description of persons for every district be transmitted to the President. Census enumerators were required to record a total of 6 inquiries in the 1790 census, calling for the names of the heads of each household and the number of persons in each household of the following descriptions: free white males 16 years and older, free white males under 16 years old, free white females, all other free, and slaves. The marshals or census enumerators were instructed to identify free white males by age brackets. It was noted that this tactic was designed to determine the country's industrial and military capabilities, and whoever refused to answer the the enumerators' questions, were assessed a hefty fine of $25 at that time. Under the general direction of the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, the marshals took the census in the original 13 states, plus the districts of Kentucky, Maine, Vermont, and Tennessee. Both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson expressed skepticism over the final count, expecting a number that exceeded the 3.9 million inhabitants counted during the close of the 1790 census. So I must ask, what number did George Washington and Thomas Jefferson expect to see at the end of taking the 1790 census? Leave your comments down below and tell me what you think. And what is also important to note here is that there were various census instructions given to the census takers concerning Indians during the early 1790s and even throughout the 1800s that I want to go over with you. Starting in the 1790s, census takers were notified of instructional specifications stating, quote, omitting Indians not taxed, distinguishing free persons, including those bound to service, from all others. During the year 1800, these instructions were slightly adjusted, stating that Indians living off of reservations and not wild should be recorded in the all other free persons column of the census form. The 1800 census classification options were free white, slave, and all other free persons. So we can easily determine that they have added the word persons to the already established category, all other free, which was used in the 1790 census 10 years prior. Interesting enough, the Indians living in the wild, generally meaning plains, and the Indians in the West or on reservations were not taxed, but those who were enumerated were recorded in the all other free column in the 1790 census. Once the Constitution called for a census of all persons excluding Indians not taxed, many other adjustments were made towards the classifications taken by the enumerators, mainly due to the sole purpose of apportioning seats in the House of Representatives and assessing direct federal taxes. On March 2, 1807, then President Thomas Jefferson signed an act to prohibit the importation of slaves into any port or place with the jurisdiction of the United States. This act deemed it unlawful to, quote, import or bring into the United States or the territories thereof from any foreign kingdom, place, or country any Negro, mulatto, or person of color with intent to hold, sell, or dispose of such Negro, mulatto, or person of color as a slave, or to be held to service or labor, end quote. This act came into effect as of January 1st, 1808. Keep that in mind. These familiar terms that I just mentioned, like Negro, mulatto, and person of color, were not used as the official classifications of race on the census during this time period of 1808. In fact, just 2 years later, in 1810, there were very few adjustments made to this third census, making Indians living off of reservations now recorded in the All Others column of the census form. This time around, the options were free white, slave, and all other, in replacement for the 1790 and 1800 census option that read all other free and all other free persons. Soon after that, the War of 1812 made American history. It was a war declared by then President James Madison because of the discovery of Great Britain supporting many Indians with rebelling against white settlers squatting in America. This war between the United States and Great Britain lasted until the year 1815, and then 5 years later, the 1820 census made some critical adjustments to the classifications of race on their forms. This time, the Indians that were living off of reservations were recorded in the free colored persons category. Note that this is the very first time ever in history where the census utilizes the term colored. And other options included on the form were free whites, slaves, and then all others, except Indians not taxed. So, generally speaking, the phrase Indians not taxed is referring to the Indians living on reservations under the aid and care of government agencies or roaming individuals or in bands over settled tracts of the country. But need I remind you that according to the 1828 Webster's English Language Dictionary, which was 8 years after this census, the noun American is defined as a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races, found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. Then, the very next year, on March 4th, 1829, Andrew Jackson began his presidency in the White House. Then on February 22nd, 1830, Senator Hugh White proposed a bill from the Committee on Indian Affairs called the Indian Removal Act. According to the Library of Congress, the Indian Removal Act was signed into law by then President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830, authorizing the president to grant unsettled lands west of the Mississippi River in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders. A few tribes were said to have left peacefully, but millions resisted the relocation policy and stayed put throughout the southern lands of America. By the 1850 census, 20 years later, another change took place, whereas the categories for race were now white, black, and mulatto. What is very important to note is that if a person looked light or mid to dark brown skin in complexion and was an Indian, the census takers recorded them as M for mulatto. According to the 1828 Webster's English Language Dictionary, mulatto is defined as, quote, a person that is the offspring of a negress by a white man or of a white woman by a Negro, end quote. According to the 8th edition of the Collins Spanish Language Dictionary, the term negress is defined as an offensive word describing a woman or girl of color, or negra, or negra, or negra.
I think most people think the census is about counting, and that's what I thought. It's really an exercise in counting before I started to do research. And I started to look back since 1790 of how we counted Americans along racial and ethnic lines. And back then it was color. And there was a controversy then, who should be counted? And should slaves who are black be counted the same as free whites? And because there's money involved and taxation involved, there was a big debate. The Northerners wanted slaves to be counted as the equivalent of free whites, and the Southerners didn't, and they agreed on a compromise that blacks slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a white person. So in that sense, the census not only cemented the color line, but reinforced how we thought of race, racial inequalities. And these categories have constantly changed, which is really fascinating. I was saying backstage that in 1850, we had a category mulatto to try to capture the amount of racial mixing. In 1850, we had a category mulatto to try to capture the amount of racial mixing.
But how can you capture racial mixing in 1850 when blood testing was invented during the early 1930s?
Between blacks and whites. In 1890, I believe, they added octoroon and quadroon to try to get at precise racial mixtures between blacks and whites. And then in 1930, because there was so much racial mixing, they actually dropped that altogether and just used black for anyone with any trace of black ancestry. And hence this idea of the one-drop rule.
So why is it a one-drop rule instead of being an actual proven fact?
Which has stayed so pervasive in the minds of Americans of who is black. And so as a result of all these practices, I think Americans have become very attuned to identifying blackness and constraining that racial category.
In the instructions for the enumerators in the 1890 census, when it comes to color, sex, and age, the enumerators were instructed to be, quote, particularly careful to distinguish between blacks, mulattoes, quadroons, and octoroons. The word black should be used to describe those persons who have 3/4 or more black blood. Mulatto, those persons who have from 3/8 to 5/8 black blood. Quadroon, those persons who have 1/4 black blood. And octoroon, those persons who have 1/8 or any trace of black blood. End quote. This sounds a bit confusing to you, right? The U.S. government created separate freedmen's lists specifically designed to rule out all copper-colored Indians from receiving any newly established benefits and land allotments that they were entitled to. The U.S. government listed all full-blooded American Indians as black or colored as their classification of race documented inside of the 1900 census, while simultaneously, white U.S. citizens were allowed to become identified as Indians by simply paying the Dawes Commission a whopping total of just $5 for each white adult and child to be listed on the Dawes rolls, replacing those people that were initially on the forms during this time period. So now, from the late 1880s to April 1st, 1902, which is known as April Fool's Day, public notices were passed around detailing that other claimants can legally make their cases for freedmen enrollment. However, this motion single-handedly allowed white citizens the rights to legally cede Indian lands, reparations, plus the optimized benefits having been set in stone previously for the people now classified as black. Now, jumping over to the 1930 census, it gave special instructions to the census takers, stating, quote, Negroes A persons of mixed white and Negro blood should be returned as a Negro, no matter how small the percentage of Negro blood. Both black and mulatto persons are to be returned as Negroes, without distinction. A person of mixed Indian and Negro blood should be returned a Negro, unless the Indian blood predominates and the status as an Indian is generally accepted in the community. And then it goes on to say, quote, Indians, a person of mixed white and Indian blood, should be returned as Indian, except where the percentage of Indian blood is very small or where he is regarded as a white person by those in the community where he lives, end quote. So in other words, according to these enumerator instructions, whites have the power to choose whatever he or she wants to be. So if a white male or female lives amongst the Indians, then he or she can consider themselves as Indians. But if he or she just so happens to move into a predominantly white neighborhood, then he or she could consider themselves as white on the census. I'm just here to make you think.